Welcome to WOW, the Woman of the Week podcast series. This episode was made possible by a generous sponsorship from BioForum. For more information, visit bioforumgroup.com. In this episode, Taryn Grome, editor-in-chief of Pharma Voice magazine, meets with Elaine O'Hara, chief commercial officer, head of North America Commercial Operations, Sanofi Pasteur.
Elaine, welcome to our WOW podcast program.
Good morning, Taryn. So nice to meet you. Thanks for the invite today, and I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Likewise. Elaine, obviously I've done some research on you and you have such a fascinating bio. I'm hoping you can share some of the details around your career journey that led you to your current role at Sanofi Pasteur.
Thanks, Taryn. Yes, actually, I was a music major for my undergraduate degree in University College Cork in Ireland, and had the chance to come to the United States to do an MBA, to have an MBA program out of St. Joseph's University back in the early 90s. And so towards the end of my MBA program, I really got interested in consulting. I wound up joining Accenture Consulting, which at the time was Arthur Andersen. And then actually after a stint with Andersen Consulting in the biopharmaceutical space, essentially in pharmaceuticals, I actually wound up joining Astra Merck, which was a precursor to what is now known as AstraZeneca. And then the rest is history after that. So really enjoy working in the pharmaceutical industry and being able to help people essentially meet unmet medical needs. There's certainly a lot of suffering in the world, unfortunately, from a health perspective. And so that's essentially where I started out, was with Astra Merck. And today I work at Sanofi Pasteur. We have a broad portfolio of vaccines, and each of these vaccines are created to address, to prevent essentially either a bacterial or a viral infection, whether it be influenza, meningitis, diphtheria, tetanus, pertussis. We have about 16 vaccines, as I say, in total, and we're in the middle of shipping our influenza campaign into the U.S. market. So it's a very challenging time, but it's also very exciting as well. And as I say, we're right in the middle of getting all of those millions of doses of vaccine out into the marketplace.
Well, it is a busy time for you, especially as we head into influenza season. I was kind of smiling to myself when you said Astra Merck. I've been around long enough to remember that company as well as the big precursor to Accenture being Andersen. You know, sometimes I think about the industry and you need a scorecard to remember who the players used to be, right? As we move through a number of mergers, acquisitions, reshuffling, etc. So I had to smile a little bit. You are really in a unique position, being in the vaccines business, which, let's be frank, until recently was really underrepresented by many of the big pharma companies. So how are you positioning Sanofi Pasteur in the market? You just alluded to bringing the influenza vaccine to market right now. So what are some of your goals?
Yeah, it's a great question. Taryn, it's just to go back. Yes, I had worked at Wyeth and Pfizer in vaccines as well. So I'm very familiar with vaccines and have worked in that space for quite a part of my career. And you're so right. It tends to be so underrepresented, and yet it is one of the most powerful tools we have in our toolbox regarding infectious disease. And I think we can see that playing itself out in dimes right now, as unfortunately we're going through the worst health crisis really in sort of I can't say the history of mankind, but certainly in the last 100 years. And unfortunately, as prepared as we thought we were going to be for this, we weren't, right? Globally, we have a massive crisis on our hands. And so, every major manufacturer that is able to sort of manufacture, develop, and produce vaccines is in the throes of doing that right now. And so what was very underrepresented in the past has now come into the forefront in terms of, everybody's attempt to work on potentially what will be a life-saving vaccine, because as COVID-19 progresses at the rates that it's progressing right now, with all of the increases in cases, not just in the US, but unfortunately we're seeing it globally, having a vaccine to actually intervene and stop the progression of the disease and the spread of the virus is really of the utmost importance. And so, as I say, what was once a very underrepresented space within the pharmaceutical world has now become sort of very much at the forefront. And what's a little difficult about vaccines is, and not a criticism, but not everybody always appreciates what vaccines actually do. I think there's a lot of misinformation that's circulating at the moment. We have information that comes immediately live time, whether it's through social media or the TV, etc. And so it's difficult to try to turn the paradigm and turn the mentality for some folks around the fact that vaccines actually really do prevent significant disease. And some of that is related to the fact that, in fact, what has happened certainly in developed countries, particularly in the United States, some of these diseases have almost been eradicated. Polio is a great example. Measles, while there have been outbreaks, for all intents and purposes, are close to being eradicated, and many other infectious diseases, which not only our society doesn't see anymore, but certainly doctors don't even see it anymore. So, folks that are graduating out of medical college, they haven't really seen some of these diseases. So the impetus behind making sure that the population is appropriately vaccinated against these bacterial and viral infections doesn't necessarily always play into the equation. And so it's very important for us as manufacturers to continue to reinforce the importance of getting vaccinated and to continue to reinforce the devastating toll that some of these diseases that can actually have on the society, because they are, in fact, usually contagious, and they can be very, very life-threatening with serious sequelae.
Absolutely. Elaine, that was one of the questions I was going to ask you next, is what role do you think the pharma industry should play in educating the public about the importance of vaccines and the good that they do? Because as you said, most people aren't familiar with polio because it's been eradicated to a great degree. So almost a victim of your own success as vaccine makers.
True enough. And I think the issue there is for manufacturers, they absolutely have to play a vital role in continuing with educational efforts around infectious diseases, as I've mentioned, such as polio. Meningitis is another serious infectious disease. And we typically spend, a lot of our time creating educational materials for constituents, for public health, for healthcare practitioners, to be able to provide to their patients, etc. And but the other thing that's important, I think, and helpful as well, is the U.S. government Health and Human Services has been right there along with manufacturers to also create appropriate educational information and to disseminate that information through all of the appropriate channels that are available today, whether it's TV, radio, or online materials. All that's available as well. So it's there. It's just it doesn't happen overnight.
No, and I think that we have a long process ahead of us to educate the public about the safety of a potential COVID-19 vaccine, so to speak. So, you're obviously right now in the midst of your flu vaccine rollout, and Americans are used to taking a flu vaccine, right? So go get your flu shot. So there's a little bit of a leg up there. But as you prepare, what are some of the steps you're taking to prepare for that flu vaccine rollout right now?
Yeah, to your point, it's interesting because the first influenza vaccines really came about, I think it was in the early 1940s. And if I recall back to some of the historical information that I've read, it was originally first developed for the military.
Sure.
To make sure that the soldiers were essentially protected against the spread of influenza. So this situation with COVID is a little bit different. But it does take time to educate, as I say, constituents, public around the benefits of vaccination. And so I think we're going to see the same thing here. Many of the manufacturers that are involved with the production of a COVID-19 vaccine have already initiated educational preparations for helping the public understand what the vaccine actually is, what the virus is, how it gets communicated to other members of society, how a vaccine intervention can potentially help stop the spread of COVID-19, and then essentially how it works, how it's safe, how it's effective. I think those are the critical components around helping folks understand what a vaccine is, what it does. And at the end of the day, I think what's most important to communicate is how the vaccine is effective, in what way it's effective, and also how it is safe to be administered. To essentially, and that's always been a bit of a tough sore point with people is you're providing a vaccine to somebody who is healthy, if you will.
Sure.
It's not like you're treating a cancer or you're treating a disease that's already underway in the physical body. And so that's why it's so important to communicate these elements to people, but also to remind folks as well is that the FDA and the CDC and all of the government agencies that essentially regulate around vaccines really do come into play in terms of assuring that the vaccine is of the highest quality and of the highest standard, and that it's met all of the criteria that were put in place to make sure that the vaccine is approvable and can in fact be given safely to the public.
Excellent. Elaine, you brought up something very interesting about the different manufacturers. Are you seeing from your role a greater level of cooperation amongst natural, maybe competitors, but banding together now in light of this global pandemic, this global health crisis?
Yeah, and we've seen that in kind of manifest itself in a couple of different ways. As you may know, Sanofi Pasteur is working on a COVID-19 vaccine, which is a protein-based vaccine. Yep. But in order for us to have enough antigen to be able to put into the COVID-19 vaccines, we need an adjuvant. And GSK has expertise in producing adjuvants for their vaccines. And so the COVID-19 vaccine that will first come to market on behalf of Sanofi and GSK, which is a first in terms of vaccine manufacturer partnership, will include the protein antigens from Sanofi as well as the adjuvant from GSK. So we have been working, both have been working with the U.S. government to bring that vaccine to market sometime next year. I think the other precedent that we've seen is a lot of the manufacturers, vaccine manufacturers, went to great lengths to basically make sure that the public were comfortable with the fact that, they will not be swayed by politics, if you will, and will continue down what has always been the traditional approval pathway for the FDA, as I mentioned earlier on, in terms of making sure that the vaccine meets all of the criteria that was set forth in its original protocol to make sure that upon licensure, the vaccine has met all its endpoints and is also efficacious and safe to be used and administered. So again, just great examples of manufacturers working together to really meet, as I say, a public health crisis.
Those are great examples. Thank you so much for sharing those with us. And I think it is exciting to see what the collective efforts can result in, right? So when we see, and obviously manufacturers have natural, competitive areas. So that's to be understood. But it's so great to see when companies come together for the greater good and what can come out of that. It's really amazing. So congratulations to you and to your counterparts over at GSK for moving this forward. I want to touch on some of your years of experience. You have more than 20 years in the pharmaceutical and vaccines industry, and you have exhibited a consistent track record of building and managing billion-dollar franchises, as well as, I understand, launching multiple pharmaceutical brands. So I'm really curious as to get to your understanding of what are some of those key components of a successful brand launch. It's not easy to do, and there's only a handful of them that have reached such success levels. So you're among a very few who have been part of that.
Yeah, thanks, Taryn. I can certainly say that, in back in my career, there were times where some of these launches seemed like they were almost impossible. And I think that's the key, actually, to having a successful brand launch. Maybe it may sound so obvious, but I think you really have to start with the end in mind and envision what does a successful brand launch look like. Obviously, you have to have all of the very tactical components around the brand launch in terms of actually the packaging, what that's going to look like, what distribution is going to look like. Branding elements have to be in play. So some very, very logistical elements have to be taken care of, right? I think that's critical, because if you miss some of those, then you've sort of missed really what are the most important pieces, because the end goal is to get the pharmaceutical product to a patient who has an unmet medical need. And then you have all of the other components around it, as I say, the branding elements, strategy. How would you like the brand to grow? How does it compete in the marketplace if there are competitors in the marketplace? And so all of that takes, discipline. It takes time as well. I think trying to rush a launch in a 3 to 6 month period can be very, very problematic, although sometimes that happens as well, particularly if you're working on a product that has an accelerated review. The other thing that's really critical is having enough talented individuals actually working on the launch and holding hands and making sure that your launch readiness plan is moving in the way that it should. There's probably nothing that's more important than having a really good team supporting the launch of a brand. It really makes the difference of having a successful launch versus a not so successful launch as well. And Taryn, the other interesting thing is every brand launch is different. I mean, there's some of the nuts and bolts that are very, very similar across a product, whether it's a biologic, whether it's a small molecule. Sometimes that piece doesn't necessarily matter, but again, the competitive situation can be quite different. If it's a vaccine, it plays, as I say, it's in a completely different market and landscape, because, for example, in order to have a successful vaccine launch, particularly if it's a pediatric vaccine, it's super helpful if it has the recommendation from the ACIP and is also part of the vaccine schedule for an infant. Without that, that can be very, very difficult to actually have a vaccine accepted in the marketplace and utilized as part of a method to protect against an infectious disease. So again, many elements come into play, all different, but some of the core, building blocks are very similar across each therapeutic area and each product that gets launched.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that. And do you think that, the launches of the future will look different than the launches of the past? I mean, obviously, currently, right now, we're operating in, a lot of folks are isolated, we're in quarantine, we're working from home. And usually when you think about a product launch, it's with a large group of people coming together in one place and getting behind the brand and going through all the steps that are necessary to deploy. But now in a virtual environment, what happens?
Yeah, we've seen very, very different product launches this year for sure, right, Taryn? I mean, we didn't have sales forces of like 300, 400 people getting together down in, Florida or some of these other locations where we typically have, substantial launch meetings, the purpose of which is to actually train the sales force to be able to understand the features and benefits of a pharmaceutical product, and then in turn be able to go into a physician's office and tell the staff and the physician, nurses, aides, etc., what are the features and benefits of the product that is now being, is now approved and launched, and what's the appropriate target patient population in which to use that product. So that's essentially that paradigm has gone by the wayside, certainly for the last 8 months. And so, yes, all pharma had to turn to a different method for training their sales force, which typically involves remote training with either Zoom or GoToMeeting or WebEx, etc., and broken up in chunks of 2 and 3 hour sort of training modules, if you will. So again, completely different to the 2 or 3 days spent at a large on-site location where you had face-to-face training. And then in turn, of course, our sales colleagues had to then set up appointments with physician offices completely remotely as well to do what we had been doing previously, which was typically a live interaction through either lunch and learn or some sort of live engagement at a hospital setting. All of that completely different. And I think, we've seen some very good successes, hopefully. The year is not over yet, but I know Sanofi Pasteur ourselves, we had a new vaccine launch for one of our influenza products, and it's gone very well. Now, it's an unusual year because there's a lot of high demand for influenza vaccine. But I know from speaking with other colleagues who have had virtual remote launches that they said it went very well for them. It went exceptionally well. They had dedicated time, and it's early months, right? Because usually it takes about 3 to 6 months to see how your product is doing post-launch. But the early indicators are all very decent. So I do think it's certainly going to change the way we engage and do business together through live meetings. I think that might be something that we will reserve for exceptional times. And also, we've been forced then to interact with healthcare practitioners in a very different way. But again, it has proven to be meaningful. I think what's required is that at the end of the day, if you have something of value to offer to a physician or a healthcare practitioner or a staff in a doctor's office, that's helpful because you're not wasting their time. There's a reason to connect and there's a reason to engage. And I think that has to really drive our interactions in the future is what of value are we bringing to our customers and why and how does it matter?
Excellent. And I love that it goes back to that value prop. Do you see a day ever going back to the old way, or is the toothpaste already out of the tube? And now through these pivots, you're finding more efficient, maybe even more effective ways of reaching your target audience within the physician base?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I would personally, I think it would be weird to go back to some of our old ways and just sort of pretend that nothing changed.
Right.
Because I do believe that people have become a lot more efficient. They are, they're more efficient with time. They're not having to spend as much time commuting, driving from one location to the other. And that really has been a huge time saver. I talk to our sales force all the time, and almost all of their engagements are remote at this moment. We had a little bit of a reprieve for about a month, depending on what the status of the state was. But unfortunately, I think we're heading back into where we were in the earlier part of the year. But everybody reports that they are having success, that they are engaging with office staff, with physicians. And then in general, it's going well. They may not see their physicians as frequently as they had previously, but they're certainly, the length that they're spending on Zoom is quite substantial. So I think that's positive. And so to go back to something that almost seems antiquated then would feel very odd, very weird. And again, I don't think it would be a good use of our time. I think everybody scrambles to really figure out what, as we all said, what the new normal was. I think we found a new normal. I think the question then, as I think you're putting very provocatively, is what does the future look like? How do we evolve with respect to how we engage, and what does that look like? What's the quality? And again, it goes back to what's the value and what's effective for our customers. I think we really have to continue to ask those questions and answer those questions, and ask our customers, ask our physicians, what would be helpful to you in terms of an engagement as we come down the next 6 months into next year. And I think if we put the answer to that question at the forefront of what we do, then I really actually think we can be successful.
I think that's great. And I think you're right. I think it's going to be a process, right? And asking those physicians what it is they need and want. And this is on top of already physicians who were, limiting sales reps visits into offices before the pandemic. So, and you think about video conferencing and engaging with physicians and their staffs in a different way. It's, we saw movement of this 10 years ago and it never really caught on, but here we are where it's really necessary now to engage in a virtual world.
Yeah, and it's much more digitally oriented. And, I'll give you an example. We, at the beginning of March, because some of these offices had closed down or they had to furlough some of their staff, and they were finding that the parents didn't want to bring their little kids into the office for their routine vaccinations because they were afraid that they might be infected if other, sick children were visiting the office. Everybody was kind of stumped. They're like, well, how do we deal with this? And that was actually one of the big learnings for Sanofi Pasteur. We reached out to customers, we conducted a survey, and we said, what's bothering you? Like, where are you at the moment? And the feedback we got was, could you help us put together like a vaccination, sort of a blueprint? In other words, how do I bring people either into my office or outside of my office so I can catch up on routine immunizations and or I can conduct an influenza vaccination clinic at the time when it's appropriate to give flu vaccine. And so that's what we did. We actually built what we called an alternative vaccination solution toolkit, which had, among other things, how to set up a vaccination tent outside of your office if you wanted to do curbside vaccination or, in-car vaccinations, etc. We also provided a blueprint for if you wanted to kind of create one-way traffic inside your office, and put all of those in the form of a toolkit online and made it available to all of our customers earlier on in the year. And so, that had some really nice uptake and was hopefully very helpful to some of our customers across the U.S.
That's fascinating. And that's not something you can go dig in the back of the filing cabinet and pull and dust something off for that. So that had to be built from scratch. That's fascinating.
We saw so many different industries really rise to the occasion and change the way that they did things. I mean, some of it's, to be honest, you go to the supermarket and I just admired how they were able to put up the perspex screen and create the 6 feet apart sort of circles on the floor. I mean, I know it sounds silly, but it was important, it was necessary, and it was helpful, and it was successful.
Right, and it was very effective. Exactly. So I think that you're right. It's interesting to see where learnings bleed from one industry to another industry to another industry, where everybody's kind of pulling on their oars in the same direction. So that's great. You talked a little bit ago about what one of the things that's necessary for a great launch is the good people behind it. So what are some of those traits you look for when you're building out your teams? What makes for a great, launch team? What are those characteristics?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think what I've looked for in the past are people that are that want to accelerate through the launch in a very positive way. And what I mean by that is, you'll always have problems, hurdles, strictures. This may not go right. Manufacturing may have an issue, and you literally have to have that sort of positive optimism to work through all of those barriers that come up in a very systematic way, right? So, and truly believe that you can get through those barriers without a doubt. So I think just behaviorally wise, that's of critical importance. I think people on the team have to have passion around what they're doing. They have to really sort of look forward to coming to work every day and enjoy it, and it's not sort of a drudgery. And then outside of that, there's always different sort of technical expertise that you need on a team as well. More and more market access expertise is incredibly important today. So working with major payers and certainly from a drug approval process, who's actually going to pay for the pharmaceutical product at the end of the day, and knowing how to navigate through that pathway is very important. You need a good strategist, some really good folks from a logistics perspective, and then branding and promotion, really. How do you generate demand? And again, I mentioned earlier on, it depends on what the actual product is. Like if it's a rare disease product, it's usually very helpful to have folks who are very, very well versed in patient advocacy, because that tends to be a much smaller part of it's a much smaller group. You're usually talking about, maybe less than 200,000 people that might be suffering from a rare disease. So it's a sort of a different skill set when it comes to patient advocacy and knowing how to actually reach all of those 200,000 or less patients, So just again, a very solid team from a behavioral standpoint, people generally passionate about what they want to do, and then the expertise across the different functions, I think, very important to have.
Thank you for sharing that. I know some of that's a little, obviously has led to your success, being able to create those teams and keep that team momentum going. What are some of the other best practices you have learned along the way that have led to your success? You've led a lot of, run several large P&L organizations. So any insider tips for those who also would like to achieve said success?
It's, I think so. You have to have, I think, having a good sense of humor and not taking it all, when I say not too serious, I don't mean that. Yeah, I don't mean that trivially, but you really have to have that sort of level of positive optimism. And, sometimes the situation can be quite serious if, as I say, if something's not going well, or you have a product issue, and you have to bring a little bit of levity to the table, because otherwise it just becomes a bit of a drudgery. So I think that's important. I think, maybe it sounds like motherhood and apple pie, but people come to work because they enjoy their work, and you have to create an environment for that to be the case, hopefully almost all of the time. So that means you have to have respect for your colleagues. You have to value their input. That's incredibly important. You're a person by yourself. You can't launch a product by yourself. You really need a whole team, and you need the expertise of every single individual on that team. I think it's really important to have a diverse team, one that has diversity of thinking, one where you can respectfully challenge each other. And, we have a saying within Sanofi at the moment, our CEO talks about it quite a lot, is, creating an environment where you can bring the best version of yourself to work every day. And I actually think that's a great mantra. You have to have an environment where people are comfortable. They can put all of their agendas to the side, and really then what they're focused on is, launching a product, overcoming a barrier, overcoming a hurdle, because, that end goal is really about getting a product, getting a medicine to somebody who needs that medication. And, it's very altruistic, but, the job then of a leader is to take all of those peripheral sort of, unwanted elements out of the way, clear the path, and make sure that path is safe, comfortable, and people, as I say, can feel empowered to do their job.
Right, and they're allowed to bring their authentic self to work and do the best possible work they can do, because they are who they are, right? As part of that, I think it's a great, it's a great atmosphere to work within. Throughout your career, you've noted a couple of times that there are going to be barriers, there are going to be hurdles that need to be overcome. Have you ever had a barrier or a hurdle that you couldn't overcome, and how did you eventually do so? And is there anything you might have done differently, in dealing with one of those challenges in hindsight?
Yeah, that's a great question, Sarah. And I remember actually, you definitely have some periods which you would call the dark periods, if you will. And I recall in my previous company, yeah, it was a bit of a tough situation. Had basically all of the next layer of leaders within the organization, and it was a smaller company, wound up leaving for lots of completely different reasons, but all in a very short time period within the space of sort of 2 months, right?
Wow.
And we had different different therapeutic areas within the company, CNS, renal, as well as oncology, and they're quite diverse. So it wasn't the easiest thing to try to find a single person to help run those businesses across the board. Very, very trying time, and it happened towards the end of the year, right as we're trying to wrap up the financial year. And I honestly, thought I wasn't going to get through it.
That's quite
a little,
a event.
yeah, a little bit worried about it. But looking back, it's like anything in life. Once you get through something like that, or it's a very, very difficult situation, first of all, it gives you pause to think, well, how could we have avoided that situation? And I think there, the organization probably wasn't as deep and as strong as it needed to be. So there weren't, ready talents that were able to step up into those roles. So that was a big learning there. And I think the second thing was, at the time when you're going through something, I guess it's the Winston Churchill saying, if you think you're going through hell, then keep going, right? You just have to get through some of those situations. And if you're, resilient enough and you've got a good organization around you that will help you get through that, usually you'll come out the other end fairly intact. And, we sort of stuck to our guns, and we launched a series of, sort of different hires, if you will, for the organization at the time, who turned out to be great hires. They were external, and I think they're actually still with the company today. So, again, as I say, the key is to just have a bit of persistence and resilience to get through those tough times.
A little bit, I would say a whole lot of resilience and persistence. I mean, that is a confluence of events there that had to be quite many sleepless nights, I would imagine, for you. In that same vein, then, so what are the traits that you think make you a good leader to have gotten through that, and then to have been successful in so many areas of your career?
I really think it comes down to having the vision of really what you're trying to do, and the reason for sort of for doing what you're doing at the forefront of your, as I say, your day-to-day operations. And so, for example, often if it's a product launch, if you know that is a vision that you have, you just keep that in mind and say, well, if we have barriers, we'll get through it. We'll just work meticulously through it, come up with solutions, brainstorm, problem solve. And so I think a lot of that really comes down to that whole aspect of just being disciplined and having the resilience and the persistence to think through all of the barriers, as I say, or problems that may come up, either known ahead of time or unknown as they come their way. But again, I'll go back to, I don't think that you can do that by yourself. You absolutely have to have a really good team, and unlocking your team's potential and continuing to make sure that they feel valued contributors, key contributors to the success of a brand or a product launch, or the life cycle management really of your brand afterwards is really of the utmost importance.
Sure. Before I get to my last question, I do want to round out to the beginning of our conversation, and you having a degree in music, which is pretty unusual for somebody who then enters into the pharmaceutical industry. So I'm curious now, having, spoken to you for the last 20 years, what really drew you to the life sciences? I'm assuming that you could have had some career in music, but what was it about the life sciences industry that really piqued your interest?
There's some some pretty interesting parallels. Music is certainly very creative, and when you think about a piece of music, particularly if it's a classical piece of music, there's this kind of traditional structure of the opening, the development, and then the sort of the end, if you will. So composers, and tend to think of these sort of blocks of three of the opening, the development, and the recapitulation. And I think getting ready for a product launch can be very similar to that, or even just a simple problem-solving episode where you sit down and everybody brainstorms, then you kind of develop on that problem. In other words, you refine it, you bring it down to maybe 2 or 3 solutions, and then you implement those solutions, and then you continue to refine them until you really have a good one in place. And maybe, structures in life are kind of like that, I suppose, in general anyway. What drew me to the pharmaceutical industry is just the ability to change somebody's life for the better in a way that's meaningful was always attractive. As I say, medicines that exist today that didn't exist 10, 15, 20, 30, 50 years ago really have the power to change people's quality of life, and in some cases cure them. And that's a really noble thing to be a part of, I think. I think we all strive to bring some meaning to each other, to society, to life. And for me, that was just really an attractive part of being part of the pharmaceutical industry. So, and really privileged to have been able to be a part of it for such a what is fairly lengthy period of time, because sometimes that doesn't always happen in industries. So I'm glad the industry has survived as long as it has, and I hope it continues to do so.
Me too. Thank you very much. I think that's a fascinating analogy between music and the journey of a drug, and I think it's something that resonates with a lot of people. And thank you for bringing your talents to making these drugs available to people who need them. So my final question is, and we ask this of all of our WOW podcast interviewees, tell me about an accomplishment or a wow moment that shaped your career or changed the trajectory of your career.
Yeah, that's a great question. For me, what I think really changed the trajectory of my career was when I moved from what was essentially sort of a single focus product, because typically earlier in your career you start to manage, you manage a product launch, etc. When I started managing more broadly portfolios of products, and then just started managing more broadly, an organization, that really changed the trajectory, because it became a lot more complicated, and you really have to multitask quite significantly, and just completely, I know it sounds weird, but compartmentalize constantly. So, as I said, if you're working in oncology, or if you've got an oncology group, you're mentally switching from CNS to oncology or to renal, and so that just requires a lot more fluidity in terms of how you think. And then also, because the teams within each one of those therapeutic areas are also constructed a little bit differently as well. And so when I moved into that more senior level of management across therapeutic areas and portfolios, it really changed up the trajectory of my career, but also just the actual physical and mental ability to think between all of those different elements within a company. I think sometimes we as humans, think that folks who are running companies are godlike, and why can't they get it right, and why don't they do this or that right? It's hard. It's actually pretty difficult to run a company in a manner which it goes smoothly all the time. And I think for me that as I say was a real eye opener in terms of how difficult it can be to continue to steer a company in the right direction, that where it's growing at a constant rate, and that you're appealing to shareholders, and the board, right? And obviously then your employee constituents as well. So once I got into that level of dynamic, it certainly was a game changer and a career changer as well, for sure.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for being part of our WOW podcast program, Elaine. I really enjoyed speaking with you, and thank you for bringing to light some of the complexities that are involved in the vaccine business and where we need to be thinking about going forward. And thank you for shining a light on all the good things that you're doing at Sanofi Pasteur. Thank you so much for being part of our program.
Karen, thank you very much. It was my pleasure, and thank you for the wonderful questions.
Thank you for listening to this episode of WOW, the Woman of the Week podcast. And thanks to BioForum for making this episode possible. For more information, visit bioforumgroup.com. And don't forget to check out our other episodes of WOW at pharmavoice.com/wow. This 2020 program is copyrighted by PharmaLinks LLC.